This video was made with support from my patrons, whose names are on screen now. If you want to, you can join them today and even get access to exclusive content. The link to my Patreon is in the description, so check it out if you're interested. Anyway, on with the show. We all know that racing games are going through a lean period right now, and that's putting it nicely. It seems that every major release over the past couple of years has missed the mark in some way or the other. From focusing far too much on elements that nobody really cares about, to just flat out failing to innovate in a genre which, as it stands, is still years behind many others. The sheer level of stagnation and the lack of new and interesting experiences available in these games has reached a level never before seen in the genre, and part of that is down to the reception. Despite the obvious deficiencies, many of these titles still achieve critical and commercial success, thus vindicating the developers and publishers in their decisions. Professional game reviewers in particular have to be held accountable. Whether it's the latest Gran Turismo or Forza, these titles which are seen as disappointments for various reasons, watering down the experiences of the previous games, or failing to innovate or add anything meaningful, they're seen as near-perfect masterpieces by these outlets. And in some cases, they just straight up lie about things to justify their review. But all of these ideas, I and many other people have mentioned before, so what's my point? Well, when it comes to the state of modern racing games, it's a two-way street. Of course, the people with creative control have the most bearing on the quality of a game, but they're making these games for us, the players. What I want to highlight today is how the discussion around racing games has influenced the games themselves. Of course, we as players are responsible for calling out these games when they fail to deliver, but are we actually improving the state of the genre? And how has this response changed over time as the overall quality of these games has slipped? Yes, I've dissected the games, the game reviewers, and now I'm going to do the same to my fellow players. It does appear that truly nobody is safe on this channel. I think it was Video Game Donkey who once said, the only difference between the game-playing public and professional game reviewers are that the reviewers get paid to say stupid shit. The rest of you just do it for free. Okay, that's not fair. Most of the comments I get on my videos are pretty good. They're well reasoned and well thought out, understanding the topic and my main points. But not always. I don't want this video to come off as my acting as if I'm better than everyone else. I mean, of course I am, but that's for other reasons. Something that we all have in common is that we will have dumb opinions. No matter who you are, this will always be true. Think about it. My videos don't just form in my mind as completely calculated ideas, they often start from a place of ignorance. And then by thinking through these ideas and researching the topic, can I finalize the concept and start work on a script. Everyone will have thoughts like these, which are often more emotionally driven. The difference is what you decide to do with them. For me, I never put out an idea in a video unless I am 100% confident in what I believe and the reasons I have for believing it. That doesn't mean that I can't change my mind if there's some new evidence or a way of thinking that I didn't consider, but this process helped me to create better thought out videos. The same can't be said for everyone, sadly. Some will just feel the urge to immediately put out whatever comes into their head without a second thought. It's part of the reason why people sometimes say stupid things on live streams. In some cases they are just stupid, but a lot of the time if they'd actually thought about it for a few more seconds, they would have realised and not said it at all. Of course, if you're subscribed to me, then you've never said anything dumb and only have rational thoughts. No, this isn't psychological manipulation, don't worry about it. Just subscribe. Anyway, as someone who makes their living commenting on racing games and the decisions made in them, I spent a lot of time thinking about the types of complaints we have. Why do we complain? What do we gain? And what sort of wider impact can these complaints have? I'm going to use my GT Critique series, where I broke down basically every problem I have with Gran Turismo 7 as an example, so I can show you my thought process. If you haven't watched it already, go and check it out. It's 3.5 hours of your life you'll never get back. So when I made a complaint about GT7, I always had in the back of my mind, if one of the game designers saw this, what am I saying to them? What is the point I'm trying to put across? And if they were receptive to feedback, how could they then act on that? I wasn't just trying to say, this sucks, this sucks, this sucks, I hate this. There was always a clear point to everything I said. And with that in mind, you might think that my least favourite type of comment about GT7 would be ones dismissing these major complaints, saying things like, I had fun with GT7, so none of these complaints matter. Those aren't great, and of course don't help matters. You can still enjoy a game and recognise its shortcomings, but I'll let you all in on a secret. My least favourite type of comment I would see about GT7 were ones criticising GT7. Now, that makes me sound like a massive hypocrite, and in some ways maybe I am, but I have a very good reason for this. Poorly thought out and non-constructive criticisms of anything take away a lot of the credibility of more justified complaints. And with GT7 in particular, I saw this happening a lot. In fact, one of the main reasons I made GT Critique in the first place was because of this. People focusing far too much on just microtransactions in the economy as the main culprits of why GT7 was so bad, when there were many other factors. Just removing microtransactions and boosting payouts was not and still won't fix the game. But the problem is that when you get so many people repeating the same argument, mixed in with other smaller complaints, which were often blown way out of proportion, it causes people on the other side to dismiss a lot of the issues. It's the idea of, oh, it can't be that bad, you're just exaggerating. People will complain about anything. Newton's third law of motion states, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. This is in relation to physical forces, but I so often see the same thing apply to online discussions. Not just about racing games, but anything really. If someone watches a movie and they think, it was alright, it wasn't the best, but still decent, and then they later come to find out there's a majority of people praising that movie as the greatest thing they've ever seen, that will affect this person's opinions. And a lot of the time in the online space, it will push them in the opposite direction. They will become more negative about it and more contrarian, almost as a reaction to the people who think so positively about it. I see this sort of thing happen so often in discussions, and the same things seem to apply to GT7 the other way round. The initial response was so strongly negative after the first few weeks that it created this counterculture movement of people praising GT7 for what it did well and acting as if the real issues were all just nitpicks. And I could see this happening in real time and wasn't happy with either narrative. Hence why I made that series. The problem is that if Polyphony could see this happening, they would just think that it's all part of the natural discourse. Some people complaining and others defending it, and they should just continue as normal. It's obvious after everything that they're never going to remove microtransactions and the always online requirement from GT7, so these complaints fell on deaf ears. In an interview, series producer Kazunori Yamauchi said that the disconnect between player expectations and what they actually deliver was healthy. And to some degree this is true, as no matter what they produce, there will always be people who are unsatisfied. But with GT7, this disconnect has been taken to such an extreme level that it simply isn't healthy, but he just doesn't see it that way. And part of that will be because of the years of complaints he's endured that people have been making about the series since around Gran Turismo 5. A lot of them were justified, but many others were not. It's somewhat understandable why he could be numbed by those experiences, and now you can see the importance of only making logical complaints instead of just throwing anything at the board. For me personally, I've made a video series explaining my issues with the game in extreme detail, and I still sometimes get comments along the lines of, so what you're saying is that basically microtransactions and greed ruin GT7, when I've just spent an excruciatingly long time putting together a video saying almost the exact opposite and why that argument doesn't make any sense. Once the ball's in motion, it's very hard to stop. Some people will kind of just believe what they want to. If they see a series of videos like mine complaining about GT7, they'll go into it projecting their own ideas, regardless of what's actually said. All of the complaints, whether justified or not, seem to just roll into one. And here is where we reach the topic of nostalgia. Nostalgia bias is incredibly powerful, a lot more so than what people often realise. This tends to be about previous experiences, making them seem a lot more important or enjoyable in retrospect than they actually were. But regardless, if you feel nostalgic for something, it must have had a fairly strong impact on you in the first place. And of course, racing games are subject to this as well. Personally, Gran Turismo 3 is the first video game I ever remember playing. In fact, it represents some of the earliest memories I have of even being alive. It is a big deal to me, and I'm not alone in that. The Gran Turismo series as a whole has given defining memories to millions of people. A lot of my complaints with GT7 are ways in which it fails to live up to those previous titles and give us unique experiences like those older games did. But that's not everything. Sure, I adore those older GTs, but would I have wanted GT7 to play exactly like them? I think it still would have been a lot better than what they actually made, but the honest truth is, no, I wouldn't. And to understand why, we need to talk about those games. So, Gran Turismo 4. The greatest racing game of all time. The genre-defining smash hit. The universally loved juggernaut that defied all expectations for a racing game. GT4 is overrated. Yeah, I'm not making any friends today. So here's the thing with nostalgia. Nostalgia often ignores contemporary context, meaning the context in which whatever you're nostalgic for existed in back when it was new or when you first experienced it. This might shock some people to know, but GT4 was not originally seen by the majority as the undisputed peak of the series which it is today, and that's mostly to do with the games that came before it. The original Gran Turismo completely changed the genre. It combined elements in ways that other racing games had never done before, and in many ways was a technical marvel on the PS1. GT2 took GT1 and improved and expanded on it in pretty much every conceivable way. The handling had been refined, the amount of content had increased tenfold, and it had a much wider international appeal thanks to all of this. It was pretty much the perfect sequel that anyone could ask for. GT3 took the series into the next generation. Whilst there had been other titles gunning for Gran Turismo's crown, and had made significant advancements in terms of visuals and handling, etc., GT3 was so far above any other games like it when it released, in overall quality and the gameplay experience, that it made you wonder why anyone else would even bother. Polyphony were the undisputed kings. There were no comparisons. The thing with GT4 was that it didn't really have a catch like the first 3 games. It was just Gran Turismo, the 4th one, which was great. If you loved Gran Turismo, you would love GT4. It was more of everything you loved. But it was clear from the comments around that time that people had expected a little bit more. Think about what new features GT4 really introduced, mainly B-Spec and photo modes. Hardly the most exciting things for racing game fans. But the problem was more about what it didn't have. Changeable time and weather, serious customization, exotic brands like Ferrari and Lamborghini, physical or mechanical car damage, more than 6 cars on the track, an actual online mode beyond the closed beta, or AI opponents that don't just drive into the player for fun. These were the exact same issues that people had with the previous 3 games, and none of them had been addressed. This is despite GT4 having the biggest gap between releases of any of the games up until that point. Almost 4 years had passed between GT3 and GT4. Sure, it had a bunch more cars and tracks and looked a bit better, but we'd already seen that before from the previous titles. It seems like most of the time was spent on the new game engine and handling model, trying to perfect it and make it feel as real as possible. So, a Gran Turismo game which doesn't innovate a whole lot and seemed far more preoccupied with being a technical showcase. This isn't to rag on GT4 specifically, because it's still an excellent game in its own right. There's a reason why it's considered as one of the classic GT games along with the first 3, but its shortcomings at the time were a lot more obvious than the others. I believe this is one of the key reasons why GT5 had such high expectations from the get-go, which it ultimately could never live up to because it promised everything which GT4 was missing, and then some. It's also partly why Forza Motorsport managed to get such a foothold in the genre, because it capitalized on what GT4 lacked. Sure, it was on Xbox, unlike GT, but it also had plenty of customization, including a livery editor, many exotic brands, fully modeled damage, up to 8 cars on the track, and a fully featured online mode. And this showed, given that its reception at the time was just as positive, if not even more so, than GT4. I don't necessarily agree with that. GT4 has aged far better in my opinion, but it really shone a light on what the game lacked. And this is the contemporary context I talk about, which hardly ever gets mentioned. Of course, that context shouldn't change how we enjoy the game in current day, but when I see comments saying all they had to do was make it like GT4 in regards to GT7, I just shake my head and move on. What else can you do? We should be expecting innovation and new ideas, not rehashing 20-year-old games that weren't even that groundbreaking at the time. And honestly, that applies to all of the previous games. I love GT3, but I don't want Gran Turismo 8 to be GT3 with new cars and shiny graphics. That completely defeats the point. And this disregard for context when it comes to these older games applies to other series as well. Forza Motorsport. Most would agree that the 4th installment of that series, much like Gran Turismo, was the best one. I played Forza Motorsport 4 back in the day when it was new and really enjoyed it. Again, it was a great counterpoint for GT5, succeeding in a lot of the areas where that fell down. but just the amount of love this game has gotten over the years has always confused me. Yes, it was very solid in all areas, it had an interesting and varied car list and a strong progression to tie it all together, but saying it will always be the greatest? Hell no. How it's often compared to Gran Turismo 5 should be a good enough hint. It wasn't as if FM4 completely destroyed GT5 in all areas. I'd say on average it was a better game, much more well put together, but at the time it still felt lacking in some ways. I mean, the disappointment of GT5 was why I jumped ship to Forza and Xbox for a time, but the impact of FM4 wasn't enough to convert me. When GT6 came out a couple of years later, I was straight back over to the PS3. But a few years down the line, I actually played through Forza Motorsport 3, its predecessor. And do you know what my big takeaway was from FM3? Just how similar it was to FM4. From the style and presentation to the gameplay itself, it all just felt way too familiar. The only major difference was the career structure. FM3 had the season play mode, whereas FM4 had World Tour. A lot of people have talked about this as a positive change, but I actually prefer FM3's season mode, and also the fact it actually ticks off events from the event list, unlike FM4's World Tour for some reason, but that's just me. My point is that, once again, the contemporary context of the game has been forgotten. The fact that it's put up on such a high pedestal to me says more about the state of the series beyond this point, rather than the game itself. At least with GT4, even if it didn't innovate or change much in terms of gameplay and game design, it felt different. The presentation and style was completely unique, and still doesn't feel like any other game in the series. FM4 doesn't even have that. It's why some people likened it to an annual sports release that just improves ever so slightly in a few areas. But none of this is to say you're wrong for thinking these games are the best in their series, because in an objective sense, you can argue that they are. My problem is when I see people holding them in such high regard, to the point where it feels like nothing could ever surpass them in their mind, that is an issue. Because it gives off the wrong impression and ultimately doesn't help the situation. When I look at the current state of the racing game genre, I don't say, man, I wish we could reverse the clock by 15, 20 years and go back to how it used to be. I say, man, there is so much potential to take what we currently have and improve it in meaningful ways with new ideas. But I know there's a lot of people who don't think that way. They want the comfort of these older games, and not just by playing them, but by wanting newer games to be just like them. And I understand why this happened. When racing games have generally failed to meet players' expectations for such a long period of time, these older games have now become the baseline for a lot of people's expectations. I'll get into that a bit later, but something that needs to be mentioned is that these discussions and ideas aren't as objective as I make them out to be. Of course, emotion will play a strong part in it. That's kind of how sentimentality works. And if there is a current racing game series which seems to elicit the strongest emotions in people, it has to be Need for Speed. So, full disclosure, I haven't played Need for Speed Unbound, nor have I played much of the classic Need for Speeds like Underground, Most Wanted, Pro Street, etc. But what I'm about to say doesn't require me to have played those games, which is the Need for Speed community needs to chill the fuck out. Now, there have been people analysing the game, the design decisions, the mechanics, the nuts and bolts of it, which is the sort of thing that I really love. But let's be real, the majority of discussions and arguments around this game are about entirely surface level things. With Need for Speed games, the presentation is a lot more important than many other titles. People come into them wanting a specific feeling or vibe. But that still doesn't excuse some of the shit I've seen. The soundtrack is not that big of a deal. I've listened to it, I've listened to the OSTs of some of the older games, I prefer the older ones, but the visceral reaction that's come from it is not normal. It's not a case like GT7 where they just got lazy and reused a ton of songs, which I feel is a noteworthy complaint to make. With Unbound, it's almost entirely personal preference. So you're not wrong for disliking it, but so few people seem to understand why the OST is the way that it is. Here's a fun drinking game. Go into any online discussion about Unbound and take a shot for every time you see someone say woke or wokeness. You will overdose and die. But given what you would have read up until that point, you might consider that a blessing. Licensed soundtracks are chosen as they are because developers and publishers think that this is the type of music that people want to hear when they play this type of game. And a lot of the time, the music is matched with the tone of the game. As someone who doesn't play Need for Speed games regularly, the OST just sounds like what I'd expect a modern Need for Speed soundtrack to sound like, for better or for worse. And of course there is the international angle as well, how it features many artists from all over the world. Again, it's all about global appeal and what they think people would want to hear, and what tone they want to convey. Of course, there are fair criticisms that can be made about it, but that strongly negative response has unfairly dominated the discussion. Because what are these complaints really saying? Don't have music that fits the tone of the game, just go back to how it was in the older titles? Or, I don't like the tone of the game at all and want it to be completely different. None of these are really constructive, but being honest, the people making these comparison videos aren't trying to do that. They're just making posts that they think will get a bit of attention. In terms of actual constructive criticisms about the soundtrack, there are a few. One is that it doesn't really feel like a racing game. There's no energy and it makes the game lack a sense of speed. The issues with sense of speed are more down to the visual elements and sound design rather than the music, but I see where people are coming from in that respect and how it could be made better. Another one I've seen is about the lack of variety in the music. But variety is a fallacy. If you have too much variety, you can lose the tone and nothing will feel cohesive. Unbound's soundtrack is somewhere in the middle. It has decent variety, given how international it is, but it is trying to fit a specific theme with each of its song choices. I feel like for most people complaining about the lack of variety, it's not about the variety. It's the tone and style of music which they don't gel with. Because if the overall tone and music selection was designed to appeal specifically to them, variety would no longer be an issue in their mind, even if it all sounded very similar. With this, I often think about GT3's OST, specifically in PAL regions. There wasn't that much variety, it was clearly going for a very specific tone, but many people loved it for that, myself included. If you go back and play GT3, it's like a time capsule. The choice of music is so specific in the tone it's trying to convey that it's like being transported to a specific place and moment in time. It's not for everyone, but that is clearly what it was designed to do, and for those who love it, variety is not at all an issue. This is why the NTSC title track for GT3 is a heavily remixed version of Are You Gonna Go My Way by Lenny Kravitz, because the original version would just sound completely wrong in that game. Anyway, the second contentious point about Unbound was the visuals, specifically the cel-shaded art style for the characters and the visual effects. I'll keep this one short. I see what they're trying to do. Some people say they don't like the mix of cartoony style and realism, and I get that, but my question is, if this is what they wanted to do, why didn't they go all the way and really commit to it? My guess is that they were testing the waters to see what the response would be like. Maybe we could see a future Need for Speed game in entirely this style, and I for one would welcome that. I mean, something that looks like Auto Modelista but in current day? Hell yes. But it is sad that realism has just been accepted as the norm for racing games. Of course I know why, because a lot of the time they're used as showcases for what's possible in terms of fidelity and performance, but it's still disappointing nonetheless. I mean, how can it be accepted that an arcade racer like Need for Speed, with its nitro boosts and cars flying off ramps and whatnot, should have photorealistic models and environments? Just think about that. It's a complete clash. It doesn't make any sense. Something else that doesn't make any sense is how Unbound has been compared to the older titles, specifically the classic Need for Speeds, but rarely ever compared to the directly previous game Need for Speed Heat in these types of discussions. For context, I actually played a fair amount of Heat when it came out in 2019 and enjoyed it, and as far as I can tell, Unbound improves on it in most areas. Not enough to make me want to buy it, but maybe I will one day. I just find it odd how the discussion is almost entirely around how it compares with the classic Need for Speeds, like Underground and Most Wanted. Again, it's not like GT7, which clearly tried to advertise itself as a true successor to the classic GT games, and then failed at almost everything they succeeded in. Unbound is trying to do something entirely different through its structure, gameplay, and story, so it just isn't useful to compare them in most scenarios, and music is probably the worst offender. If you go back to the early to mid 2000s, those soundtracks were the coolest things ever. If you were like 10. It was edgy and over the top, but generally still reflective of what was popular at the time. Of course, a lot of people now listen to these songs and consider them modern classics because of that. They are pastiches of that time, a happier time for many people. So what people are doing is comparing the OSTs of these older games, with all of the context and understanding that's been built up over the years, to the OST of Unbound, which has none of those benefits. It's just not fair. Like I say, I do prefer those older soundtracks, partly because I grew up in that era and listened to that music, but that's not the point. The severity of the backlash is not at all warranted, and if you put yourselves in EA and Criterion's position, what are you supposed to do with this feedback? Just pretend we still live in 2005? It doesn't help. In a previous video, I talked about Toyota's ongoing absence from Need for Speed, something entirely unrelated, and was still able to see some of the vitriol from these types. People just seem to get way too emotionally worked up about this series. It's sad to say, but the elephant in the room is that for a large number of people, no matter what these franchises do with their future games, nothing can live up to what has come before. I love lots of classic games I grew up with, but to think that they were created in this unique time and space, which means they can never be surpassed or even matched, is ludicrous. And for the game developers making the creative decisions, this is just expected. They know with every new release they're going to see comments like, "This isn't as good as X was, just make it like X." And for them, that type of comment is truly meaningless. If they're trying something new and interesting, they know that they're going to see comments like that regardless of the quality of whatever new thing they've made. There will always be pushback. For everything I love about GT3, for example, I know equally as well that it can be improved in so many ways. The fact that there is nothing that has come out in the 22 years since then that captured my attention in the same way doesn't mean that it's perfection, and that the genre peaked in 2001. It's simply that what I value the most in a racing game is encapsulated the best by GT3, and part of that is due to growing up playing GT3. But I still hope that one day there will be a racing game that takes everything it does and just improves it and adds to it in new and original ways. That is my dream. One that, at this rate, I may have to realise myself, but a dream nonetheless. If I had to pick one thing that I've noticed as a bit of a trend in modern racing games, it would be that game designers don't really seem to understand what people want from their games. Of course, I'm going to use the example of GT7, where it's plainly obvious that Polyphony don't understand why people loved the past GT games, and so GT7 ended up as this disjointed mess, still trying to pretend it's just like them. Codemasters' Formula 1 games are another great example, where in F1 2021 they removed all of the classic F1 cars, and then in F1 22 brought in supercars to effectively replace them. Look, we can argue about licensing costs and the ease of obtaining them, but the bottom line is that nobody wanted the supercars and nobody plays a Formula 1 game for them. The same goes for all of the lifestyle features they've added. It was simply EA's attempt to try and appeal to a wider audience and find new ways to monetize the game. By far the strongest asset the F1 games actually have is their career mode, and My Team especially, where you get to effectively run your own Formula 1 team. The last F1 game I played was F1 2020, where this feature was introduced, and that was specifically why I picked it up. But the game mode has barely changed in the subsequent 3 years since then, and as such I've had no reason to come back. Instead, they focused far more on their Breaking Point story mode, inspired by the Drive to Survive documentary melodrama, and the unbalanced, unappealing and confusing F1 World live service style online mode.
Over 12,000 of you voted in that, which I think is incredible, so thank you so much for that response. And a very healthy majority of 72% said no, I don't play it at all. And that's the problem here. That's the problem. Really, the only thing that F1 World is the series and solo multiplayer events. And like I've just kind of shown you by example, there's just not enough here. I thought there was going to be so much stuff rolling in week after week. I thought these were going to refresh after like 2-3 weeks. Like, the fact they're not makes me think that maybe they weren't as prepared as I thought they were about adding new content to this game mode.
It truly is a masterclass in how to squander something special. They took this focused and engaging sports title and are now trying to turn it into Test Drive Unlimited, where you get to dress up your avatar and buy furniture for your imaginary house. Take a hint, nobody cares. Trust EA to ruin something in such a spectacularly stupid way. But speaking of Test Drive Unlimited, we have Solar Crown coming out at some point. And a few weeks ago we got a gameplay reveal and it was pretty bad. Ironically, it had the opposite problem. TDU was built on the lifestyle elements and exploration, and they basically showed none of that, just driving around aimlessly for the most part. Of course, it's still in development, so we can excuse some of the roughness, but you really have to wonder why they showed off some of this stuff when it clearly wasn't ready. It was not a great advertisement for the game. Still, we know that the lifestyle features like going to car dealerships, etc. will be part of it. It's the main way that the game can differentiate itself, so they better make that side of it good, otherwise there will be pitchforks. But again, this is just another example of developers not really understanding what people want to see in their games. But, to be fair, it would be very difficult for them to understand what the players want if the players themselves don't even understand what they want. A much more polished gameplay reveal came a couple of months back, courtesy of the upcoming Forza Motorsport reboot. Quite a few things were shown off and I was fairly interested, so I made a video discussing them. It was a more speculative, podcast-style discussion, unlike my usual highly critical video essays like this one, just casually talking about the key points. That video had a quite noticeably more negative response than anything else I've ever put out. And initially, I just couldn't understand why. Was it something I said? But I was fairly speculative, not really making any definitive statements. But what I came to realise is that since I was talking about a hot topic at the time, some people were just really emotionally charged about the whole thing. Whether they wanted to believe that it will be an amazing game, or had already decided that it was complete trash. Nothing I could have said would have changed that. And from reading the comments, not only on my video, but about the gameplay reveal as a whole, the most controversial topic had to be the car XP system. For those who don't know, in Forza Motorsport, you won't be able to purchase upgrades for your car using money, but instead with XP, experience points, which can be earned by doing races with the car and also completing specific challenges. This is a massive departure from what we're used to with Forza, particularly the Horizon spin-offs, which allow you to do these upgrades, including engine and drivetrain swaps, very easily, as long as you have enough cash, which isn't really a problem in those games. I personally think this change is really interesting, as you now have to build up your car and build that relationship with it as you go. It tallies a lot with how I normally play these types of games. Of course, I recognised how much different this would be, and not everyone would be happy, since they would have to adapt their way of playing, and meant they were more limited in terms of what they could initially do with a car. But that's all part of the experience, experimenting with different builds and trying different things. Still, it wouldn't appeal to everyone. And I did see many comments echoing the same idea, how much of a different style of playing and gameplay loop it would create, for better and for worse. But the sheer amount of other comments I saw completely condemning the system outright as absolute garbage, simply because they can't V8 swap their Ford Fiesta within the first 5 seconds of owning it, was off the charts. People were bewildered by this simple design change. A design change which isn't even that original. Other genres of games have been doing this for decades, and I'm sure there are other races which have done something similar, effectively treating the car as if it were its own character that has to naturally level up. I'm not trying to say that this is going to make Forza Motorsport an incredible game, because how they balance it will be important, and in practice it may end up not really working if they don't implement it correctly. But it's way too early to make that call, and the potential is there, if they get it right, to do something unique and interesting. The problem with a lot of these comments is that they don't seem to recognise that this decision is a trade-off. One of the biggest complaints with modern Forza is that everything feels aimless. There is a real lack of progression, as many things are way too easy to obtain, and this results in the game lacking long-term goals to keep the player invested. There's nothing to work towards, it's all just instant gratification. The car XP system is a direct response to this. It couldn't be more obvious. And of course, there will be downsides. Like I said, you can't just shove an oversized engine into a shopping cart even if you have plenty of cash to do it. But with each argument, you have to consider the positives and the negatives. That is one of the negatives, and one of the positives is that your experience of completing races, events, and challenges will feel more meaningful and rewarding when you consider that you're working towards a long-term goal. And only then can you V12 swap your ice cream truck or whatever stupid bullshit you want to do. And again, it comes back to, what are these comments actually saying? Are they saying the current much ridiculed system is fine and doesn't need changing? Because from not a single one of these comments saying that it's a terrible idea have I seen someone suggesting alternatives or ways to improve the current system. So it has to be asked, what do these people actually want? For me, the problem is that Forza has been like this for such a long time that people are just conditioned to play it that way, and any deviation from that will scare and confuse them. That is the truth. And again, like I say, it may not end up working as they envision, but right now, that's not really relevant. The point is that conceptually, as an idea, it has solid foundations, ones that have been proven to work in other genres of games, so why not give it a go? You cannot say that it is objectively bad game design as some of these commenters believe. True innovation in any field has to defy expectations. If you're in a boardroom pitching an idea and everyone unanimously agrees with it, you are almost certainly not coming up with something revolutionary. If you were, there would be some pushback. People saying, I'm not sure about this. Of course, that isn't mutually exclusive to innovation, but that is what's necessary to really change the game. Do you know how hard Kaz had to fight to get the original Gran Turismo made? Slaving away for years, hiding the underpinnings of it in another game entirely just to convince Sony that it was worthwhile to make. Because nothing like it had ever been done before. Of course, I'm not trying to compare the car XP system with the birth of the entire subgenre, they're on completely different levels. But the point is that this mentality, this pushback against trying something new in favour of maintaining the status quo just because that's what we're used to, is stupid. If these sorts of people were around when GT was first being pitched, they would be saying things like, what, so it's like driving an actual car, but we play racing games to escape reality? Spending money to buy cars at a dealership? Don't be ridiculous, people don't even enjoy doing that in real life. With any decision, you have to weigh up the positives and the negatives, but so many people only seem to see the negatives in anything that seems unfamiliar. Forza Motorsport's Car XP system, Unbound's art style and effects, these are not the most groundbreaking ideas, and yet they still see major pushback for daring to try something new. If you're not happy with the state of the genre, but still try to enforce the status quo, what do you actually want? A lot of the time, they just want what they already know. Remember when I said about players' baseline expectations reverting back to these older games? Don't give us something new and interesting, give us what we already had. Our Gran Turismo 4s, Forza Motorsport 4s, Need for Speed Most Wanted, but just make them better. Of course, there will be diminishing returns, but the truth is that had the genre followed the natural path of evolution and improvement in terms of gameplay and game design, not just on the technical side, which we've seen, the genre should be far ahead of what we had in the 2000s. And the fact that it isn't doesn't mean that we should try and recreate this golden period of racing games. We should be expecting far more in current day. There is a saying that people don't know what they want until you give it to them, and with the racing game community right now, I don't think this could be more true. That quote from Kaz, mentioning the disconnect between player expectations and his philosophy, in its intended context with GT Sport and GT7, is in some ways laughable. Because what Kaz often wants to put in these games is seemingly dictated by whichever side of the bed he gets out of in the morning. It could be an incredible system that has the potential to create new and fascinating experiences, or the biggest crock of bullshit you've ever seen. And there's not much in between. But if you apply this sentiment to truly groundbreaking games like the original Gran Turismo, it just makes perfect sense. And that must be why he says things like this, and thinks this idea is healthy when with the current state of GT7 it is anything but. There is something I want to address about my critique of GT7. The core foundation I built that series on was the idea of what GT7 could be, what I envisioned was possible for it given the untapped potential. That is why I think my points are able to hit as hard as they do. Throughout that series, I do of course compare GT7 quite often to the previous games in the series, and I think a few people got the wrong idea with that. The main reason I did that was because GT7 was billed as a true successor to the classic GT games. It was very obvious from the marketing and what Kaz has said before and since then. And of course, I wanted to highlight how they completely failed at this. But my point was never that I want GT7 to just be like the older games. When I compared it to GT3, I wasn't saying that it should be designed exactly like GT3 in those areas. If I wanted to play GT3, I will play Gran Turismo 3. Sure, it would still be far better than what we have with GT7, but my ideal vision for it is not just GT3 2022 edition. The problem with making such a direct homage to those games is that it will limit what you can do with the game. And guess what? If they did make, say, GT4 but in current day, most of the people asking for that will still prefer GT4, regardless of what they do. By allowing GT7 to be its own thing, it can break through that ceiling of potential, because what I envisage is something completely new, taking the best elements of classic GT and expanding them alongside the more recent additions, using the technological advancements to not just make the visuals a bit sharper or the handling a bit more dynamic, but to actually innovate the gameplay loop. Think about what they could do with the structure, event types, and interesting scenarios to put the player in. The classic GT formula is quite simple and frankly a bit outdated at this point. It has been done so many times, so if they ever do bring it back, they need to make meaningful changes that actually expand the experience and not reduce it. This is what Gran Turismo can be. This is what the people who say just make GT4 again completely miss. It can be so much better. You know, another Gran Turismo content creator by the name of Rowdy put out a poll a couple of months back asking people what they think needs the most attention in GT7. And in there were a couple of things that I've drawn attention to as well, like the AI, the economy, and bringing actually new features. The poll has over 2,000 votes, and the option that came out with a landslide victory was more cars and tracks. Why? We are already getting more cars and tracks in the monthly updates. But what we're not getting are improvements to the actual AI, not GT Sophie, which is just a gimmick for now, or fixing the completely unbalanced economy beyond trying to plaster over the cracks with circuit experience and time trial payouts, or more race events that actually use the bulk of the car roster and give them purpose. I'm sure if I did this poll on my channel, the result would be slightly different given the skew of audiences, but the fact that I can make a massive video series detailing all of the major fundamental issues with the game, receive almost unanimous support and praise for it, and then turn around and see something like this, it just makes me wonder, what is the point? It's like with GT7, Polyphony has given us a cake, which is underbaked, falling apart in many places, and overall quite sloppy. But the decorations look nice, and I'm making the argument that they should rebake the cake and do a proper job of it and actually give us what was promised. But then we have a large number of other people saying, just keep putting icing on top. Yeah, that's what we want, more icing. If that is what you truly want, then fine, but you do not have the right to then shout about these issues as if you actually care. Because you don't, really. You want short-term gains, not long-term improvements. I've said it before and I'll say it again. GT7 still has the potential to be the greatest racing game of all time. But simply adding more cars and tracks is not going to get it there. Not in a million years. It's simply a validation for Polyphony's lackluster monthly updates. Why should they try to address the main issues or add anything that can provide new and interesting experiences when they can just pile more icing on the cake and people will continue to eat it up? It's just f***ing sad. If there's one thing that should be obvious from this video, is that I have a huge passion for racing games. They have defined a massive part of my life. As I've said, making these videos is my livelihood. I do this full time, and in my free time, a lot of that is spent playing these games. And even outside of the games themselves, they've influenced a lot of the content I like to watch, and even the music I listen to. I know that this video will piss off quite a few people, but I don't really care. I'm making this video because it's what I truly believe, not because it's what I think people will want to hear. I've thought about this enough to know that nothing anyone can say will really change my opinion on these main points. I'm sick of seeing excuses from both sides. I want to see improvements. In recent years and even months, people have been pushed away from the racing game community. They've stopped engaging in discussions, and some content creators have stopped covering certain games altogether, simply due to the toxic response. Some of you are really exhausting to deal with. A lot of racing game discussions are just like running in circles. Nothing is achieved, and by the end of it, you hope to never have to do it again. And it often stems from completely pointless shit, like people comparing the graphics of these games and having heated debates about some f***ing polygons. There are people who are so quick to tear down anything, but so reluctant to help rebuild it. That's because they don't actually care. They're just doing it for their own benefit. The origins of critiquing things comes from a desire to see them improve, but with the advent of the internet and social media, this idea has been severely warped. Many people only do it for self-serving motives. If you're watching this video, there's a good chance that you have a passion for racing games as well, and surely you must want to see them thrive. The genre is not in a great place right now, but it can get better, and I believe that with enough time, it will get better. I do not have all the answers, and I know that my reach is very limited, so I'm never going to affect global change. To expect anything else would be foolish. But I can ask that to each and every person watching this video, no matter who you are, you can always do better. All of us can. When you have an issue with a racing game, consider 1, why it ended up as it did, and 2, what you're going to say about it. Try and see the situation from a game designer's point of view, even if they would never see your comments. what positive changes could be made in response to what you say? This is the type of thing that leads to good, constructive feedback and not just shouting into the void. I'm not trying to say that you have to come up with a solution whenever you make a criticism. That would be like only being allowed to complain about your meal at a restaurant if you're also a chef and can work out what needs to be changed in the recipe. But having these ideas in mind will lead to better feedback, and that's good for everyone. Now, nostalgia will be a part of all of our lives, it's just human nature, but with racing games, so many people seem to just use it as a crutch to ignore originality, which isn't good. Emotions seem to get the better of people in so many of these discussions. You can appreciate these older games without letting them cloud your judgment. The people designing these newer games have to take a huge responsibility for their shortfalls, but it's my belief that, as a community, collectively, we are not helping the situation. I do not see how someone with creative control of one of these games can look at all of the feedback from all sides of the community and glean anything from it. It's just a mess of contradictions and confusion. There are so many people who wear their rose-tinted glasses with pride that to a lot of developers, the message is clear. No matter what we do, it will never be good enough. So a lot of them don't even seem to try. Why should Forza reinvent the Horizon series if people will still clamour for Horizon 1 regardless? Horizon 5 was a commercial and critical success, so frankly, from their perspective, there isn't much to gain. But we all know that the games can still be far better than they are right now. It's more about how we convey that idea to the people who make the decisions. And people will have different opinions, sure, but some complaints are just so needless, arguing about things that just don't warrant it, or in some cases where people have just clearly not thought through their arguments. It does more harm than it does good. If we want racing games to be better, we have to be better. It's time to stop hiding in the past. Oh, and also never pre-order games, you filthy animals.